The Romanian Revolution was a period of violent civil unrest in Romania in December 1989 and part of the revolutions of 1989 that occurred in several countries. The Romanian Revolution started in the city of Timișoara and soon spread throughout the country, ultimately culminating in the show trial and execution of longtime communist leader Nicolae Ceausescu, and the end of 42 years of communist rule in Romania. It was also the last removal of a communist regime in a Warsaw-packed country during the events of 1989, and the only one that violently overthrew a country's government and executed its leader. Early protests occurred in the city of Timișoara in mid-December on the part of the Hungarian minority in Timișoara in response to an attempt by the government to evict Hungarian Reformed Church pastor Laszlo Tokes. Tokes had in July of that year made critical comments against the regime's systematization policy to Hungarian television, and complained that Romanians did not even know their human rights. As Tokes described it later, the interview, which had been seen in the border areas and was then spread all over Romania, had a shock effect upon the Romanians, Securitate as well, on the people of Romania. It had an unexpected effect upon the public atmosphere in Romania, and people now sought revolution and a change in government in light of similar recent events in neighboring nations. Social and economic malaise had been present in socialist Romania for quite some time, especially during the austerity years of the 1980s. The austerity measures were designed in part by Ceausescu to repay foreign debts. Shortly after a botched public speech by Ceausescu, rank-and-file members of the military switched, almost unanimously, from supporting the dictator to backing the protesting population. Riots, street violence and murder in several Romanian cities over the course of roughly a week led the Romanian dictator to flee Bucharest on the 22nd of December, with his wife, Deputy Prime Minister Elena Ceausescu. Captured in Târgoviște, they were tried in a kangaroo court by a drumhead military tribunal on charges of genocide, damage to the national economy and abuse of power to execute military actions against the Romanian people. They were convicted on all charges and immediately executed on Christmas Day 1989, becoming the last persons condemned to death and executed in Romania. The National Salvation Front quickly took power after Ceausescu was toppled, promising free and fair elections within 5 months. Elected in a landslide the following May, the National Salvation Front, reconstituted as a political party, installed a series of economic and democratic reforms, with further social policy changes being implemented by later governments. Since that point, Romania has become far more integrated with the West than its former, albeit tepid, relations with Moscow. Romania became a member of NATO and the European Union in 2004 and 2007, respectively. Democratic reforms have proven to be moderately successful. Economic reforms continue, with Romania still possessing, for example, one of the largest child poverty rates in the developed world, one place ahead of USA. Background: in 1981, Ceausescu began an austerity program designed to enable Romania to liquidate its entire national debt. To achieve this, many basic goods, including gas, heat and food, were rationed, which drastically reduced the standard of living and increased malnutrition. The infant mortality rate also grew to be the highest in Europe. The secret police had become so ubiquitous as to make Romania essentially a police state. Free speech was limited and opinions that did not favor the Communist Party were forbidden. The large numbers of Securitate informers made organized dissent nearly impossible. The regime deliberately played on this sense that everyone was being watched to make it easier to bend the people to the party's will. Even by Soviet bloc standards, the Securitate was exceptionally brutal. Ceausescu created a cult of personality, with weekly shows in stadiums or on streets in different cities dedicated to him, his wife and the Communist Party. There were several megalomaniac projects. such as the construction of the grandiose House of the Republic, the biggest palace in the world, the adjacent Central Civic and a never-completed museum dedicated to communism in Ceausescu. Today the Casa Radio. These and similar projects strained the country's finances and aggravated the already dire economic situation. Thousands of Bucharest residents were evicted from their homes, which were subsequently demolished to make room for the huge structures. Unlike the other Warsaw Pact leaders, Ceausescu had not been slavishly pro-Soviet but rather had pursued an independent foreign policy. Romanian forces did not join its Warsaw Pact allies in putting an end to the Prague Spring, an invasion Ceausescu openly denounced while Romanian athletes competed at the Soviet boycotted 1984 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles. Conversely, while Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev spoke of reform, Ceausescu maintained a hard political line and cult of personality. The austerity program started in 1981 and the widespread poverty it introduced made the communist regime very unpopular. The austerity programs were met with little resistance among Romanians and there were only a few strikes and labor disputes, of which the Juvali miners' strike of 1977 and the Brasov rebellion of November 1987 at the truck manufacturer Stegul Razu were the most notable. In March 1989, several leading activists of the Romanian Communist Party protested in a letter that criticized the economic policies of Ceausescu, but shortly thereafter he achieved a significant political victory. Romania paid off its external debt of about $11 billion, several months before the time that even the Romanian dictator expected. However, in the months following the announcement, austerity and a shortage of goods remained the same as before. It initially appeared that Ceausescu would weather the wave of revolution sweeping across Eastern Europe. He was formally re-elected for another 5-year term as General Secretary of the Romanian Communist Party on the 24th of November at the party's 14th Congress. On the same day, Ceausescu's counterpart in Czechoslovakia, Miloš Jakeš, resigned along with the entire communist leadership, effectively ending communist rule in Czechoslovakia. On the 11th of November 1989, before the party congress, on Bucharest's Brezoanu Street and Kogălniceanu Boulevard, students from Cluj-Napoca and Bucharest demonstrated with placards saying, "We want reforms against Ceausescu government." The students, including Mini Paraschivescu, Gratian Volp and the economist Dan Capariu-Șlachta from Cluj, were detained and investigated by the Securitate at the Rahova Penitentiary on suspicion of propaganda against the Socialist Society. They were released on the 22nd of December 1989 at 14:00. There were other letters and attempts to draw attention to the economic, cultural and spiritual oppression of Romanians, but they served only to intensify the activity of the police and Securitate. Another factor in the revolution was the Decrete policy, a draconian policy banning contraception and abortion. This policy, begun in 1967, resulted in a baby boom, but also resulted in high rates of poverty and child mortality. By 1989 these children had all reached adulthood, and many of them were among the students who started the revolution that overthrew Ceausescu. Timișoara uprising. On the 16th of December 1989, the Hungarian minority in Timișoara held a public protest in response to an attempt by the government to evict Hungarian Reformed Church pastor Laszlo Tokes. In July of that year, Tokes had criticized the regime's systematization policy in an interview with Hungarian television, and complained that Romanians did not even know their human rights. As Tokes described it later, the interview, which had been seen in the border areas and was then spread all over Romania, had a shock effect upon the Romanians, the Securitate as well, on the people of Romania. It had an unexpected effect upon the public atmosphere in Romania. The government then alleged that Tokes was inciting ethnic hatred. At the behest of the government, his bishop removed him from his post, thereby depriving him of the right to use the apartment to which he was entitled as a pastor, and assigned him to be a pastor in the countryside. For some time his parishioners gathered around his home to protect him from harassment and eviction. Many passers-by spontaneously joined in. As it became clear that the crowd would not disperse, the mayor, Petre Mo, made remarks suggesting that he had overturned the decision to evict Hokes. Meanwhile, the crowd had grown impatient, and when Mo declined to confirm his statement against the planned eviction in writing, the crowd started to chant anti-communist slogans. Subsequently, police and Securitate forces showed up at the scene. By 1930 the protest had spread and the original cause became largely irrelevant. Some of the protesters attempted to burn down the building that housed the district committee of the Romanian Communist Party. The Securitate responded with tear gas and water jets, while police beat up rioters and arrested many of them. Around 2100 the rioters withdrew. They regrouped eventually around the Romanian Orthodox Cathedral and started a protest march around the city. But again they were confronted by the security forces. Crackdown riots and protests resumed the following day, the 17th of December. The rioters broke into the district committee building and threw party documents, propaganda brochures, Ceausescu's writings and other symbols of communist power out of the windows. The military were sent in to control the riots because the situation was too large for the Securitate and conventional police to handle. The significance of the army presence in the streets was an ominous one. It meant that they had received their orders from the highest level of the command chain, presumably from Ceausescu himself. The army failed to establish order, and chaos ensued, including gunfire, fights, casualties, and burned cars. Transporter Amphibious Blind 8 armored personnel carriers and tanks were called in. After 2000, from Piața Libertatea to the Opera there was wild shooting, including the area of Despal Bridge, Cali Lipove and Cali Girocalui. Tanks, trucks, and tabs blocked the accesses into the city while helicopters hovered overhead. After midnight the protests calmed down. Ion Coman, Ilya Mate and Stefan Gusa inspected the city. Some areas looked like the aftermath of a war. Destruction, rubble, and blood. On the morning of the 18th of December the center was being guarded by soldiers and Securitate agents in plainclothes. Mayor Mo ordered a party gathering to take place at the university, with the purpose of condemning the vandalism of the previous days. He also declared martial law, prohibiting people from going about in groups of larger than two. Defying the curfew, a group of 30 young men headed for the Orthodox Cathedral, where they stopped and waved a Romanian flag from which they had removed the Romanian Communist coat of arms. Expecting that they would be fired upon, they started to sing Deșteptă-te, Romain, an earlier national song that had been banned since 1947. They were, indeed, fired upon. Some died and others were seriously injured, while the lucky ones were able to escape. On the 19th of December Radu Balin and Stefan Gusa visited workers in the city's factories, but failed to get them to resume work. On the 20th of December massive columns of workers entered the city. About 100,000 protesters occupied Piața Opera and chanted anti-government slogans. Nu suntem poporul, Armata ECU Noi, New Virginia Fifrica, Ceausescu Pica. Meanwhile, Emil Bobu and Prime Minister Constantin Dascălescu were sent by Elena Ceausescu to solve the situation. They met with a delegation of the protesters and agreed to free the majority of the arrested protesters. However, they refused to comply with the protesters' main demand, and the situation remained essentially unchanged. The next day trains loaded with workers from factories in Oltenia arrived in Timișoara. The regime was attempting to use them to repress the mass protests, but after a brief encounter they ended up joining the protests. One worker explained, "Yesterday our factory boss and a party official rounded us up in the yard. handed us wooden clubs and told us that Hungarians and hooligans were devastating Timișoara and that it is our duty to go there and help crush the riots. But I realized that wasn't the truth. On the 18th of December, Ceausescu had departed for a visit to Iran, leaving the duty of crushing the Timișoara revolt to his subordinates and his wife. Upon his return on the evening of the 20th of December, the situation became even more tense, and he gave a televised speech from the TV studio inside the Central Committee building in which he spoke about the events at Timișoara in terms of interference of foreign forces in Romania's internal affairs, and an external aggression on Romania's sovereignty. The country, which had no information about the Timișoara events from the national media, heard about the Timișoara revolt from Western radio stations like Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, and by word of mouth. A mass meeting was staged for the next day, the 21st of December, which, according to the official media, was presented as a spontaneous movement of support for Ceausescu, emulating the 1968 meeting in which Ceausescu had spoken against the invasion of Czechoslovakia by Warsaw Pact forces.